The brown foal could not have been more than 6 months old, his small frame trembling not from the cold, but from sheer exhaustion that seemed to radiate from his very bones. His ribs protruded like piano keys beneath a coat, so dull and lifeless it appeared to absorb what little light reached him. The gentle curve of his neck, which should have been filled with the proud arch of youth, instead drooped with the weight of neglect. His legs, those delicate instruments meant for flight across open fields, shook with each labored step as if the simple act of standing required every ounce of strength he possessed. This foal was left to die in the cruelest way possible, abandoned to face an auction crowd that would see him as nothing more than a burden to be discarded. The rain drummed against the tin roof of the auction barn like impatient fingers, each drop echoing through the cavernous space where the final lots of the evening were being wheeled in on squeaking carts. Most of the serious buyers had already claimed their prized horses and departed into the storm, their trailers loaded with champions and their wallets considerably lighter. But in the dim corner of the holding pen, illuminated only by a single flickering bulb, stood a sight that made even the most hardened livestock handlers pause mid-step and shake their heads in quiet dismay. But it was his eyes that told the true story of his suffering. Where there should have been the bright spark of curiosity that marked every healthy foal, there existed only a hollow emptiness that spoke of an animal who had already given up hope. They were the eyes of a creature who had learned too young that the world held more cruelty than kindness, more abandonment than love. The handlers moved around him with practiced efficiency, but their usual banter had died to respectful whispers as they prepared him for what everyone assumed would be his final moment in the spotlight. The foal stood motionless in the center of the ring, his small hooves planted on sawdust that had been stained by countless other animals throughout the long evening. He did not lift his head to acknowledge the crowd or show any sign of the spirit that should have burned bright within him. Instead, he simply existed, waiting for whatever fate these strangers would decide for him, unaware that his next few minutes would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise or became just another casualty of a world that had already shown him its darkest face. What happened next would haunt the memories of everyone present, as the sound of human cruelty echoed through that auction barn like a curse that stained the very air. As the foal was led into the auction ring on unsteady legs, his handlers moving with the mechanical efficiency of men who had long ago stopped seeing animals as anything more than merchandise, the sparse crowd that remained began to stir with a kind of ugly anticipation. The brown foal's pitiful condition, his ribs jutting out like accusatory fingers beneath his dull coat, sparked something dark in the hearts of those who measured worth only in dollars and bloodlines. The auctioneer, a thin man whose voice had boomed confidently through dozens of sales that evening, now found his words catching in his throat as he announced the lot number. His practiced smile faltered as he took in the pitiful sight before him, and for a moment the showmanship that was his livelihood abandoned him completely. The sparse crowd that remained shifted uncomfortably in their metal folding chairs, their conversations dying to uneasy murmurs as they realized they were about to witness something that would test the very limits of human compassion. The auctioneer, his face flushed with embarrassment and barely contained anger, struggled to maintain the professional composure that had served him through thousands of sales. His voice cracked as he attempted to start the bidding at a mere $10, the insulting price hanging in the air like a final indignity heaped upon the broken animal. The foal stood motionless in the center of the ring, his small frame casting a shadow that seemed too large for his frail body, his spirit as shattered as the bones that barely held him upright. The laughter started as a low rumble from the back rows, growing louder and more vicious as it spread through the barn like wildfire. Someone shouted that the foal looked more suited for the glue factory than any respectable stable, and the cruel jest was met with howls of approval from men who had forgotten what it meant to show mercy to the helpless. Another voice called out that they should charge admission just to watch something so pathetic try to walk, and the mockery grew into a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The jeering continued to build, feeding on itself like a flame consuming dry timber. Men who considered themselves pillars of their communities revealed the ugliness that lived beneath their polished exteriors, their laughter sharp and cutting as they competed to deliver the most devastating insult. The sound bounced off the metal walls and wooden beams, creating an echo chamber of cruelty that seemed to press down on the defenseless foal like a physical weight. But then, cutting through the cacophony of mockery like a blade through silk, came an unexpected voice. It was quiet at first, barely audible above the din, but it carried a quality that made the laughter falter and die like a candle flame snuffed out by an unseen hand. The sudden silence that followed was more profound than any noise that had come before, as if the very universe had paused to listen to what would happen next. The voice belonged to someone who had been watching from the shadows, someone who saw beyond the broken ribs and hollow eyes, to something that the laughing crowd could never comprehend. In that moment, as the last echoes of cruel laughter faded into uncomfortable silence, the fate of the brown foal hung in the balance between human cruelty and human compassion, between a world that discarded the broken and one that believed in second chances. The woman who would change everything sat unnoticed in the shadows, her presence so quiet that even the barn's flickering light seemed to dim in deference to her watchful silence. From the back of the nearly empty barn, where the poorest seats offered the worst view but the clearest perspective on human nature, Martha Whitfield had observed the entire spectacle with the kind of stillness that comes only from decades of witnessing both cruelty and grace. Her weathered hand, marked by countless hours of gentle labor, rose slowly through the stale air thick with dust and diminished dreams. The laughter that had filled the barn moments before died instantly, as if her raised hand had the power to draw poison from the air itself. The men who had been so eager to mock the broken foal now found their tongues frozen, their cruel words evaporating like morning mist before the rising sun. Martha's voice, when it finally broke the silence, carried the firm resolve of someone who had made countless decisions between right and wrong, between turning away and stepping forward. At 73 years old, Martha possessed the kind of invisible authority that wealth could never purchase. Her simple cotton dress, faded from years of washing but impeccably clean, marked her as someone who didn't belong among the wealthy horse traders with their pressed shirts and silver belt buckles. Her worn leather boots, resold more times than she could count, had walked through barns and pastures where healing happened quietly, away from the judgment of those who measured worth in bloodlines and bank accounts. Yet something in her steady gaze, something forged in the furnace of experience and tempered by compassion, commanded a respect that silenced even the cruelest voices. $50, she said, the amount falling into the silence like a pebble dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond the simple transaction. It was not a fortune, barely enough to buy a decent saddle, yet it might as well have been a king's ransom for the way it transformed the atmosphere in that barn. The auctioneer, his face flushed with shame at what he had witnessed, brought his gavel down with a decisive crack that seemed to echo with finality. As the sale was completed and the broken foal was officially hers, a strange silence settled over the barn like a blanket of snow muffling the harsh edges of the world. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something profound, as if everyone present sensed they had just witnessed a moment that would ripple through time in ways they could not yet comprehend. The wealthy buyers who had laughed so heartily minutes before now avoided eye contact, their consciences awakened by the quiet dignity of a woman who had seen value where they had seen only waste. Martha rose from her metal folding chair with the careful grace of age, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She had rescued countless animals over the decades, but as she walked toward the ring where the brown foal waited with his hollow eyes and protruding ribs, she carried with her the weight of knowing that this moment would test every skill she had learned in her lifetime of mending broken things. The journey that would change two lives forever began not with fanfare, but with the gentle creak of an old trailer door closing and the soft murmur of comfort offered to a creature who had forgotten that kindness existed in the world. The drive to Martha's small farm stretched through winding country roads where the late evening mist clung to fence posts like ghostly witnesses to countless stories of loss and redemption. Through the slats of her modest horse trailer, Martha spoke in the kind of gentle tones that carry decades of experience, healing wounded souls, her words floating back to where the brown foal stood on trembling legs, his hollow eyes reflecting the passing headlights like distant stars. She had spent 40 years rescuing forgotten animals, pulling them back from the brink of despair with nothing more than patience, grain, and an unshakable belief that every creature deserved a second chance. Her small farm had become a sanctuary for the discarded, the broken, the animals that others had written off as lost causes. But something about this particular foal stirred memories she had carefully buried beneath layers of daily routine and purposeful work. Memories that rose now like water from a deep well, bringing with them the sharp ache of old grief. Her own prize stallion, from decades past, had possessed the same delicate bone structure, the same aristocratic lines that spoke of bloodlines worth more than most people's homes. Most haunting of all were the eyes, those same intelligent depths that should have sparkled with curiosity and mischief, but were now dimmed by suffering so profound it seemed to have reached into his very soul. The stallion she had lost to a barn fire 30 years ago had looked at her with that same mixture of hope and resignation, that same silent plea for understanding that transcended the barriers between species. As her headlights swept across the familiar wooden gate that marked the entrance to her property, Martha felt the weight of recognition settle in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. This wasn't just another rescue, another broken animal to mend with gentle hands and infinite patience. This foal carried with him the echo of her greatest loss, and perhaps, if she was brave enough to believe it, the possibility of her most profound healing. The modest farmhouse stood silhouetted against the star-scattered sky, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that spoke of simple comforts and hard-earned peace. The barn, weathered but sturdy, waited with empty stalls that had sheltered countless animals through their journeys from despair to hope. As Martha parked the truck and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, listening to the foal shift nervously in the trailer behind her, she knew with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of experience that this rescue would test every skill she had learned, every reserve of strength she had built, every fragment of faith she still carried in her heart. The broken foal in her trailer wasn't just another animal in need of saving. He was a mirror reflecting her own capacity for healing, a challenge that would demand not just her knowledge but her willingness to open old wounds in service of mending new ones. The miracle that would unfold in the coming weeks began not with dramatic gestures, but with the quiet persistence of a woman who understood that healing happens in whispers, not shouts. The first weeks were touch and go, each day a delicate negotiation between hope and despair, with Martha spending countless hours beside the foal's stall like a sentinel guarding something precious beyond measure. Her worn wooden chair, positioned just outside the gate, became a fixture in the barn, and from this humble post she offered water by hand and spoke in soft tones that gradually penetrated the wall of fear the foal had built around his broken heart. She named him Phoenix, not for the grandeur of the mythical bird's flight, but for her unwavering belief in his potential for rebirth from the ashes of his suffering. The name carried with it all her accumulated faith in second chances, all her knowledge that sometimes the most broken things hold within them the seeds of extraordinary beauty. It was a name whispered into the darkness of his despair, a promise that this barn, this woman, this moment would be different from all the abandonment that had come before. The transformation began almost imperceptibly, like the first hint of dawn touching the edge of night. Phoenix's ears, which had remained flattened against his skull in permanent defeat, began to flicker forward when Martha approached, tiny movements that spoke of curiosity, cautiously awakening. His hollow eyes, those windows to a soul that had learned too young that the world held more cruelty than kindness, began to track her movements with something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't complete despair either. Martha read these microscopic signs, like a scholar studying ancient text, understanding that each small gesture represented a victory fought and won in the invisible battleground of a broken spirit learning to hope again. She celebrated the day his head lifted slightly when she entered the barn, treasured the moment his breathing steadied instead of quickening at her approach, and held close to her heart the first time he didn't flinch when she reached toward him with gentle hand. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked morning when the world seemed wrapped in gray silence. Martha offered him grain from her palm, as she had done dozens of times before, her hand steady despite the tremor of age, her voice a constant murmur of encouragement. This time, instead of backing away or standing frozen with fear, Phoenix took a tentative step forward. His soft muzzle, warm as a prayer, touched her palm for the first time, and he accepted the grain with a delicacy that spoke of manners learned in a kinder world he barely remembered. Tears that had been held back for weeks finally spilled down Martha's cheeks as she recognized the first genuine spark of trust being rekindled in those intelligent eyes. It wasn't just food he had accepted from her palm, but the possibility that not all hands would bring harm, that not all humans would abandon him when he needed them most. In that moment, as rain drummed against the barn roof and Phoenix chewed slowly, methodically, Martha knew they had crossed the first bridge on the long journey back to wholeness. The metamorphosis that would leave an entire community speechless began with something as simple as sunlight catching on a coat that had learned to shine again, transforming neglect into a testament of what love could accomplish when paired with unwavering determination. As spring arrived with its promise of renewal painted across the countryside in shades of green and gold, Phoenix's transformation became impossible to ignore. His coat, once dull as weathered leather, began to gleam with the kind of health that proper nutrition and devoted care could nurture into existence, each strand catching the morning light like burnished copper. The ribs that had once protruded like accusations against a world that had failed him gradually disappeared beneath healthy flesh that spoke of regular meals offered with gentle hands and patient persistence. His neck, which had hung with the weight of defeat, now carried itself with the first hints of the pride that should have been his birthright. But the most profound transformation wasn't visible to the casual observer, wasn't something that could be measured in pounds gained or muscles developed. The true miracle lived in his spirit, in the way the hollow look that had haunted his eyes, like a ghost, gradually gave way to something Martha had almost forgotten how to hope for. First came curiosity, tentative and fleeting, flickering across his expression when a butterfly landed on his fence post, or when the barn cat stretched lazily in a patch of sunlight. Then, like dawn breaking after the longest night, came something even more precious: playfulness. Martha watched in wonder that bordered on disbelief as Phoenix began to explore his small world with the enthusiasm of youth. Finally allowed to express itself, he would toss his head at nothing more than the joy of feeling strong enough to do so, would kick up his heels in celebration of legs that no longer trembled beneath his weight. The pasture that had seemed too large for his frail frame now became his canvas, and he painted across it with galloping strides that grew stronger and more confident with each passing day. His legs, those delicate instruments that had once shaken with exhaustion, now carried him with the fluid grace that spoke of breeding lines worth more than most people's homes. The neighbors who had initially dismissed Martha's latest rescue with polite but skeptical nods began to slow their trucks as they drove past her fence line, their conversations shifting from gentle concern for her inability to accept that some things couldn't be saved to genuine amazement at the magnificent young horse emerging from what had seemed like certain death. Phoenix's gallop across the spring grass became a daily spectacle that drew viewers who pretended to have other business along that country road. His coat rippled with muscle and health. His movement spoke of power held in perfect control, and his bearing carried the unmistakable aristocracy that no amount of neglect could completely erase. What they were witnessing wasn't just the recovery of a nearly dead foal, but the resurrection of something extraordinary that had been hidden beneath layers of suffering and abandonment. Martha would lean against her fence post each evening, watching Phoenix graze in the golden light of sunset, and marvel at how completely he had reclaimed not just his health, but his identity. The broken creature from the auction barn had transformed into something that demanded respect, something that whispered of bloodlines and breeding that ran deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. The secret that would change everything lay hidden in the very bones and sinews of the horse. Everyone had dismissed as worthless, waiting like buried treasure for someone with the knowledge to recognize what others had been blind to see. One afternoon in late spring, when Phoenix had grown strong enough to move with the fluid grace that marked his every step, a visiting horse trainer named Samuel Morrison stopped by Martha's farm to examine a mare she was considering selling. But the moment his experienced eyes fell upon Phoenix grazing in the pasture, his attention shifted completely, drawn by something in the young horse's movement that made his breath catch in his throat. Samuel had spent 30 years evaluating bloodstock, had seen champions born and legends made, and he possessed the kind of educated eye that could read breeding in the angle of a shoulder, the set of a head, the precise way hooves touched the ground. As he watched Phoenix move across the pasture with that distinctive floating gait, his mind began cataloging details that spoke of lineage far beyond anything that should have ended up neglected at a backwater auction. The slope of the shoulder, the length of the neck, the perfect balance of power and elegance in every stride painted a picture that sent chills down his spine. After careful examination that involved measuring bone structure, analyzing conformation, and studying the subtle details that marked true breeding, Samuel suggested something that Martha had never considered. DNA testing, he explained, could reveal the truth hidden in Phoenix's genetic code, could unlock the mystery of how such obvious quality had ended up discarded like refuse. The results that arrived 6 weeks later would rewrite everything they thought they knew about the brown foal who had been left to die. Phoenix was descended from champion bloodlines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, his genetic heritage reading like a who's who of racing royalty. His great-grandfather had won the Kentucky Derby, his bloodline traced back through generations of horses whose names were spoken with reverence in breeding circles around the world. The foal who had been laughed out of the auction ring, who had stood trembling with ribs showing like accusatory fingers, carried within him the genetics of legends that had thundered down racetracks and into history books. Martha stood in her modest kitchen, staring at the papers that transformed her $50 rescue into something beyond price. The numbers on the page spoke of value that dwarfed her annual income, but more profound than any monetary worth was the realization of what had almost been lost forever. This wasn't just a rescued animal recovering in her pasture, but a living treasure that someone had discarded with the casual cruelty of throwing away a broken toy. The irony cut deep as she remembered the laughter that had echoed through the auction barn, the cruel jokes about glue factories and worthless strays. Those same people who had mocked Phoenix's broken condition, had been blind to the championship blood flowing through his veins, had failed to see past the surface damage to the priceless heritage that lay beneath. Martha realized she held not just a healed horse, but living proof that sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as the most worthless, waiting for someone with enough wisdom to look beyond appearances and see the truth that others miss entirely. The revelation that would transform ridicule into reverence spread through the horse community, with the unstoppable force of truth finally set free, carrying with it the uncomfortable weight of justice delayed, but not denied. Word of Phoenix's remarkable recovery and his hidden heritage moved like wildfire through barns and breeding farms, through coffee shops where horsemen gathered and auction houses where reputations were made and destroyed. The DNA results became the stuff of legend, passed from trainer to trainer, each telling adding another layer of amazement to a story that seemed too extraordinary to be true yet was documented in black and white genetic proof. The same people who had filled that auction barn with cruel laughter now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of eating their words along with their pride. Phone calls began arriving at Martha's modest farmhouse before dawn, voices she recognized from that terrible night now speaking in tones of barely controlled desperation rather than mockery. The offers that poured in grew larger with each passing day, astronomical sums that reflected not just Phoenix's proven bloodline but the collector's desperate need to own a piece of the miracle they had been too blind to see. Martha would sit at her kitchen table each morning, sorting through envelopes that contained enough money to buy a dozen farms like hers, offers that could have secured her comfort for the rest of her life. But as she watched Phoenix through her window, now a magnificent stallion whose every movement spoke of the championship blood flowing through his veins, her decision had already crystallized with the clarity that comes only from understanding what truly matters. The transformation was complete in ways that transcended mere physical healing. Phoenix had evolved from broken foal to magnificent stallion, his coat now gleaming like burnished copper in the sunlight, his movements carrying the fluid grace of generations of champions. But more profound than his physical restoration was the journey from that night of cruel laughter to this moment of universal reverence, from being dismissed as worthless to being recognized as priceless. The auction barn that had echoed with mockery now buzzed with whispered stories of the horse that had been saved for $50 and was now worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. The handlers who had shaken their heads in pity now spoke of Phoenix with a kind of awe reserved for legends, and the buyers who had laughed loudest now offered the most money, as if they could purchase absolution along with bloodlines. Martha found her purpose, not in the offers she refused, but in the choice she made each day to let Phoenix run free across her pastures, to give him the life he deserved rather than the life others would pay for. She had discovered that some things, once broken and carefully mended, become more valuable than they ever were in their original perfection. Phoenix had found his home, not in spite of his journey through darkness, but because of, and Martha had found her calling in proving that sometimes the most worthless seeming souls carry within them the seeds of something extraordinary, waiting only for someone with enough wisdom to nurture what others cannot see. The boy who had trembled on auction, Sawdust, now thundered across green pastures with the bearing of royalty, his story a testament to the transformative power of unconditional love meeting hidden greatness. The legacy that would outlive them both was written not in record books or bloodline registries, but in the quiet moments when broken things learned to trust again, when despair transformed into hope through nothing more powerful than persistent love offered without condition or expectation of return. Years later, Phoenix stood in Martha's pasture as a testament to the power of compassion and second chances, his presence a living reminder that some of life's most valuable treasures come disguised as its most worthless cast-offs. His magnificent frame now carried the bearing of the champion he had always been destined to become, his coat gleaming with health that spoke of careful tending and infinite patience. His offspring carried his bloodline to racetracks around the world, their hoofbeats echoing across finish lines from Kentucky to Dubai, each victory a vindication of the $50 investment that had saved more than just one horse's life. But more importantly than any ribbon won or purse claimed, Phoenix's story became something larger than himself, inspiring a new generation of rescuers who learned that sometimes the most broken creatures hold within them the greatest potential for extraordinary beauty. Martha, now in her 80s with silver hair that caught the light like spun silk, would sit by his pasture each evening in the same wooden chair she had positioned outside his stall during those first desperate weeks. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of gentle healing, would rest peacefully in her lap as she watched Phoenix graze in the golden light of sunset. In these quiet moments, her mind would drift back to that terrible night in the auction barn, remembering the sound of cruel laughter echoing off metal walls, the sight of a broken foal standing alone in sawdust stained by countless other animals' fear. She remembered the silence that had followed, when love proved stronger than despair, when compassion cut through mockery like dawn breaking through the longest night. The auction barn had witnessed thousands of sales over the decades, transactions that moved millions of dollars and changed the fortunes of breeders and buyers alike. But none had been more valuable than the $50 miracle that taught everyone present a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. Never judge a soul by its scars, Never dismiss potential based on present appearance, and never underestimate the transformative power of someone willing to see beyond the surface to the treasure hidden beneath. Phoenix's story became a whispered legend in barns across the country, passed from trainer to trainer, from owner to groom, a reminder that greatness often comes packaged in the most unexpected forms. The horse who had trembled on auction, Sawdust, now stood as proof that with enough patience, enough faith, and enough love, even the most broken spirits could rise from the ashes of their suffering to reclaim their rightful place in the world. As the sun set each evening, and Phoenix lifted his noble head to survey his domain, Martha would smile and remember that sometimes the most profound victories aren't won in the spotlight, but in the quiet moments when two souls find each other across the vast distance between despair and hope, proving that love, patient and persistent, remains the most powerful force for transformation this world has ever known. Thank you for watching this incredible story of resilience and redemption. If Phoenix's journey moved you as much as it moved us, please hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that prove miracles still happen every day. I'll see you in the next video.